Thank you for listening to Mailbox Money, your guided tour through safe, sacred, and speculative investing with a plan and a purpose to do more good with newfound peace of mind. All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Mailbox Money. I'm Jackson Wood, joined as always by Ryan Kruger, partner, my friend, somebody I look up to. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about what I'm calling the title of this episode, the Siren Song of Investing. And there's a disclaimer here at the beginning. It's going to start off a little bit in the weeds, taking me back to, I think, junior year of college, maybe sophomore year, when I read Homer's Iliad. And I'm going to bring this back down to earth here in a second after I talk about this incredible story that I tie to investing. So there's a scene in Homer's Iliad where the main character, Odysseus, he's on a ship. He's a captain of a ship. And they sail their ships past these very treacherous rocks. And they're called the Sirens in the story. And what happens when you sail your ship or row your ship through or past the Sirens, these beautiful creatures called the Sirens come out and they sing this very beautiful song. And it's kind of notorious in this story because all of the crew and the captain of these ships hear the song and see these beautiful creatures and they get distracted and they chase after them. And it ultimately results in them crashing their ship into the rocks and they drown. And Odysseus knew about the siren. He knew the story of the sirens and he wanted to hear them, right? He wanted to see what it was like, but obviously he did not want to crash his ship into the rocks and die. So what he did in the story was he had his crewmates fill their ears with beeswax so that they were effectively deaf. And then he tied himself to the mast of the ship and he had his crew tie his hands behind his back so he couldn't move or get out. And he told them that no matter what he did, no matter how loud he would scream or whatever he would say, they needed to keep going past the rocks, past the sirens. And what it was going to allow him to do was he, Odysseus, could hear the song of the sirens, but the crew, because they had the wax shoved in their ears, which sounds like a really kind of unpleasant thing to do, they survived. So he was able to kind of experience what the song of the sirens were like, but they were safe and they lived because the crew didn't have any idea what was going on and they just sailed right on past the rocks. So the question that you're probably asking yourself is, what in the world does this story from a book and a poem that I read in college have to do with investing? I promise I'm going to tie it in here real quick. But before I do that, I want to share just a quick quote tweet that I saw from our friend Dividend Growth Investor over the weekend. And I'm happy to say that there's only one part of this that I disagree with. And it's at the very first part. And he says, I'm on this pretty much one-man crusade. I know of at least two others that are on this crusade with him. So that's the part that wasn't true, but the rest is true. I'm on this pretty much one-man crusade to have the people, particularly retired people, look not at the value of their portfolio, but at the income stream that they get. Look at the dividend and try to ignore the market. The stream of income is what matters, and dividends tend to increase over time. Then he says there's only been a couple of time periods in all of the recorded history of the S&P 500 where the dividend has gone down. Look at the dividend and try to ignore the market. It's the income flow from Social Security, pensions, whatever it might be, and dividend income that is what is important. So you probably can kind of figure out what I'm saying here, but the siren song of investing is all of the noise that we hear. I don't particularly want to pick on Jim Cramer or our friends at CNBC, but there are so many distractions that investors face, both do-it-yourself investors, those working with the financial planners themselves. There are all of these distractions or these sirens that are very difficult to ignore sometimes. And what we know from the story of Odysseus is that when you pay attention to these sirens, it distracts you from getting to where you need to go. And instead, you end up crashing your boat into the rocks. Now, fortunately, we don't have to worry about crashing our ships into these rocks. But the idea of getting distracted or being emotionally vulnerable is something that we face every day when it comes to investing. every time that you pay attention to a siren song with investing, you're increasing your chances of a shipwrecked portfolio. So as an investor, what I think and what we believe here is that one of the most valuable and wisest things that you can do is recognize your own emotion, recognize your vulnerability, and put the beeswax in your ears so that you do not expose yourself to the siren song of investing. Right. So that's kind of my literature flex here. It's going back to my English class.
And this is why we need a play-by-play and a color man, a two-man podcast, because let me come speak to anybody like myself who hated literature in school. We're going to be on opposite ends of the spectrum here and arrive at the same place. And I think this analogy to investing is important, but oftentimes the fanciful, emotional, you got to have better psychology, turns people off, just as the hardcore math both feel inaccessible to certain investors, and they shut it down. And like a lot of things, they'll figure it out or do it later, or don't open the statement, and somehow or another it'll take care of itself. And mistake none of this as this idea of hanging in there because it always works out in the end is a myth. It's a business building recurring revenue model for Wall Street. I don't think that works. I think understanding and getting involved on one end of the spectrum or the other, or ideally if you can find where these paths cross. So I hated literature in school. My teachers probably hated me even more because I don't know why I was hardwired to just challenge. We'd read these thick books. And I was tired when I got home from basketball practice. I couldn't read very fast. And so I would always be upset the next day when the test was what so-and-so meant when they said, and we read these books. I had a hard time even understanding some of them. And I always wanted to ask that teacher, says who? Like, that's what you think he meant or she meant. Like, I want some evidence. So I love math class. I loved math class for some reason, because I like the idea of figuring out complex formulas to simple solutions. So in both cases, and I think Jackson's example is really, really important. And let me say, it's not just for beginning investors. That too many folks say, just hang in there. You got to control your psychology. You can't be distracted. Let me tell you, sitting next to senior portfolio managers, fund managers, I can speak from that side of the world that professional investors are exactly as prone to being distracted as if you're listening or wondering about this for the first time. So give yourself some grace. And whether it be the hardcore math, which I'm happy to talk about, along with this guided tour that Jackson's going to walk us through, my proposal to anybody listening to this would be, if you can just adopt some simple, consistent rules or nudges. One of my favorite books, again, it wasn't literature, it was fact-based. So this scientist went around the world and figured out where people are living to 100 in a couple places more than anywhere else. Like, you get a cheat code to how to live healthy and happy to 100. And so he proved it was simple things. It wasn't a crazy workout regimen, again, like investments, that seems intimidating. It was simple walks. It was the fact that they had a garden. It wasn't because they grew vegetables that were better than our friends at the grocery store. It was because they were outside just a little bit. It wasn't some crazy stretching class. They were bending down and doing a little bit of gardening. And then they were eating with their family at the end of the day. There's a couple of secret, consistent playbooks that I found fascinating. And my hope there in the non-literature book is consistency and simple, but not easy, because consistent isn't easy and disciplines aren't. But I'm glad you brought it, because you're so much smarter and worldly. And when you say look up to me, I'm just a little older, and I'm not as good with some of that literature. So take us back to get us away from those rocks, brother. I'm here with my calculator when you need me.
I love that you said that. So as I was writing this up, I had the fear of, I don't want this to come across as, don't focus on these things. Don't do this. Ignore yourself, become the stoic. How about let's get some advice of what to focus on? What can we focus on? What can we do? These simple, repeatable processes that we always talk about. And it comes as no surprise if you've listened to any of our podcasts. What I'm about to say is that you should focus on the dividends, right? And I'm going to go through some benefits of focusing on the dividend over portfolios and sirens and what it can do for you emotionally and financially. So the emotional benefits of dividend investing. I want to cite a study that is probably more up Ryan's alley here, the quantitative analysis from Dalbar.
Let's
And
party.
what they do, what was that?
Let's party.
Let's go. Here come the numbers, right? All right. So what they do is they look at investors' performance, and they look at the investors' performance compared to the funds that they own. So this is interesting, right? They take investors and they look at what return the investors are able to generate compared to the funds that they own inside of their portfolios. So if you go from 1992 to 2022, because we don't have 23 yet, the S&P 500 has a compounded rate of return, annual rate of return of 10.7%. And we have talked a lot about it's never at 10.7. It's always up and down, but average them together for the sake of this example, 10.7%. So if you had $100,000 in 92 and you invested it, didn't touch it, that portfolio grows to $2,082,000 and some change, right? However, investors in the equity section of their portfolio only generate an average return of 7.1% per year. So they underperformed the very funds or strategies that they owned in their investment account. So $100,000 portfolio grows to $789,000. So there's a $1.3 million gap that is due almost entirely to paying attention to sirens or being distracted. They feel good when the market is going up and they go into stocks, and when they don't feel good and the market is beating them up, price is coming down, they sell, and it ultimately results in this gap of $1.3 million, which is pretty substantial. So I want to propose that if you look at the dividend growth rate or the dividend rate of the stocks that you own, it can create this anchor that will help you weather a storm and also gives you something good to look at and math to back up your investment decisions. So the best example I could come up with was the stock Eli Lilly. Obviously not a recommendation to buy the stock, but I'm going to share it on my screen. And if you look at the price return, you can see that there have been periods of time when the stock has gone through drawdowns, significant drawdowns. There's also periods of time on the chart where it seems to have gone nowhere. And I put up a 5-year chart here. And if you're looking at price only, this can be a very difficult thing to endure when the price isn't going the direction you think. But if you have a reason to own the stock, and if you look at the dividend, it looks much better. And it gives this calming effect to you as the stakeholder that now you have a reason to own the stock. You understand why you're investing. And if you look at the dividend rate, it just looks like a nice, beautiful set of stairs, right? And so I want to just, this first section is, it gives you this comfort and this reason to own investments when you focus on the dividend inside of the portfolio instead of simply looking at the market price or the volatility of a stock. And I want to detach from just staring at screens and seeing charts go wild all day. Instead, focus, like Warren Buffett says, on the business that you own and the underlying fundamentals and the dividend that company can sustainably pay to you as a stakeholder. When prices, I'm going to talk about this, and this is not a prediction that prices are going to come down, but I want to talk about the benefits of dividend investing when the price does come down. So let's say an example that we own a business or a stock at $100 per share. And let's say it pays you a dividend of $2.50. So every reinvested dividend that stock pays you will buy you 0.025 shares of that exact same company if the price is $100 per share. Now, if the price comes down to 50, let's say the market's rough, the price drops to 50, that same $2.50 dividend will now buy you 0.05 shares of that company. So your dividend is able to buy you more and more ownership inside of that business when the prices come down. Now, psychologically, this is a completely different way to think about a bear market or a down market, as opposed to just looking at the price. You're buying more and more of this business. And as long as the financials are healthy and it's improving and you understand why you own it, not saying you'll cheer for a bear market, but you probably are looking at yourself and thinking, to steal Ryan's words, what bear market? What are we talking about here, right? And if that dividend, that's only in my example, if the dividend is static and not growing. But what happens if the dividend is growing, right? If you're getting more than $2.50 in a dividend because the company's financials are improving, not only are you continuing to buy the stock, but you're buying more and more of the stock. And those dividends that are being reinvested are now going to grow in dollar terms the amount of money you receive as a dividend. And so the example here, very simple math, but it just flips this entire experience of investing. Instead of focusing on price and volatility, it flips it so that you understand what you're doing and why you're investing and what you're receiving as mailbox money each time a dividend gets paid. And I think that's pretty important.
I keep thinking back to your ship to start this episode. I'm going to listen to that again because that's the first time I thought about literature in high school. And this is just another shout out to those literature teachers and the reason that when somebody says, oh, you're dividend guys, what does that mean? Oh, you like dividends. This should never be about what we like. That's where this should be about what stakeholders and investors that we serve need. So my issue with those literature teachers or writers is having to figure out what they think I'm supposed to say here. Was like math was the reason the dividend works. And this is process of elimination. And I'll give you a story you just reminded me of, going back to when I started in the mailroom on Wall Street in 1996 and listening to and overhearing and watching billions of dollars being managed and how, again, inside the belly of the beast, this is not individual investors who mess this up. It's professional investors who mess this up. So the dividend simply has stood the test of time as the one metric you can hold in your hand to know what's real. If you want to use that beeswax and tying yourself, like, how do I figure out what I know works? Not negative motivation of what not to be distracted by, but what do you know works? And I think back about, you used the drug stock example, and too many people think this is about figuring out what the next new product launch is going to be, how to predict price appreciation, and who's going to have a drug that gets approved by the FDA, or in technology, who's going to have the next big gadget. And I will just submit what I learned. And I will never forget, you just gave me a flashback that I did not particularly expect. But when you were talking about, if I'm listening to this, I might think that Jackson Wood, to talk about, and for full disclosure, it's currently one of our holdings, but Jackson is not a pharmaceutical expert. He is not predicting what the FDA is going to say about this next new blockbuster drug. As I was surrounded by, apparently, a bunch of incredibly well-credentialed scientists when I worked on Wall Street, there was one stock that the entire office was cold calling to warm calling to the biggest of the big clients, and every single one of them was loaded up on this stock that, if I recall correctly, fired lasers of some sort into people's hearts who were on death's door. It was going to bring them back to life. It was a miraculous cure. And it was impossible, to your Siren song, if you listened to some of these poets on the phone and they had a story. I was sitting in there like, holy cow, this is going to revolutionize. This is incredible. The opportunity to get before, and I would listen very little time. And people think that the Boiler Room movies are fiction. It's true. I lived it. I heard it. And I saw people get separated from their money as a result. And I'll never forget, as they went before, and you didn't just buy a little bit of this stock. The more you heard, I mean, these people were loaded up, including the professionals who had a disproportionate amount of their money, including leverage. And if I think about the simple nudges available to anybody who is not an expert on predicting what the FDA might approve next, it would be, there's one set of cell disciplines that I adopted back then as my version of beeswax, and I didn't know much yet. But it's the one set of rules that has never changed through the history of this firm, and I believe has more to do with the reason we're here today than any of my great ideas or yours. And that was, and by the way, any cell disciplines, if you talk to any professional, let alone individual investor, ask them strictly what their cell disciplines are and get ready for a long pause. Not one of those calls that lead to action that are persuasive. Just, okay, what's the cell discipline? Well, my simple set of rules as a humble suggestion to anybody, these simple nudges that could work for anybody on their own. A small percentage, in our case, less than 1% of an overall nest egg is ever invested in any one idea, your greatest idea in the world. That's number one. So you'll never open the barn door for any problem wrecking a portfolio. One, that's it. Two, never add 1 penny to a losing position, no matter how great it is, no matter how much you know it's going to get approved. By the way, that did not get approved, and all of those positions went to zero. And number three, have a sell stop that even when you don't know you're wrong yet, at a certain point before buying something, give me anything. It doesn't even have to be a stock. I believe this in life. Use it on your blue jeans. Instead of buying a new pair, stop eating. That's for me. That's no personal judgment. That's three, a simple sell stop. And those simple nudges, and the reason that one stock you mentioned, and there are several, I didn't know which one of these companies was going to be a big winner. And that's magic too, that discipline, the humility of, we make them compete against each other every month for a reason and rescore them every month for a reason. A lot of this has to do with being willing to admit, I don't know which is going to be the biggest winner. I do know that there are going to be small losses when we're wrong, and then small, balanced roster. And then they got to compete again at the end of the month again. Those simple nudges, because I do think, selfishly speaking, a guided tour of the ship captain that has seen where all those rocks are, I think you can do this on your own. And I also think a guide, because I believe in many in my own life, a guide is exceptionally valuable, so that instead of being separated with your money by folks that are convinced this is the next great idea, back to your point on dividends, Jackson, you can hold it in your hand to know you're reunited with your money. You're holding it, and it should be at a beating inflation. And the question should not be, what did you think happened? What went wrong? What do you predict next? Is, did you get a pay raise last year? Because guess what? Just like my literature teacher, no opinions are necessary. I'm sorry, that's the last time I'm going to reference her. I don't think she's listening. But she didn't like it.
Yeah. If my 12th grade English teacher saw that I was writing things on the internet, and might have a heart attack. No, I love that. And I love how you talk about, did I get a pay raise? Because the one other thing, I got two more sections here that I want to talk about. And I love that you focused in on income inside of the portfolio for the stakeholder and the investor. Dividends answer that question. We've got two questions. And if you spend time on our website, you'll see them. How much is enough? Do I have enough? And am I going to be okay? And I want to make this simple. All you need to reach your freedom day or be financially independent is income from various sources like Social Security, pension, and your dividend portfolio that are greater than your needs and your wants, and you are at your freedom day. And that gives you math, that gives you numbers and data to focus on. Maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you will be there, but you will know exactly in time where you are on your journey to your freedom day. To me, that is powerful. To me, that gives us purpose and reason for doing all this and listening to the podcast and investing and opening accounts. It gives you a real goal and a target to focus on. Now, I don't want to come across as some literature snob, because I spend most of my time watching, or most of my free time watching Disney Pixar movies with my daughter. She loves them. Disney Plus is the greatest invention of all time. So I was watching the Pixar movie Brave, where the Princess Merida is riding this Clydesdale horse, this gigantic horse, and she's this tiny little girl through the woods, full speed, firing arrows off of her bow at these targets that are swinging on the trees. And while my daughter was watching it and trying to get me to buy her a horse, I was thinking about the 4% withdrawal rate and the 4% rule in finance. And I don't know why my brain went there, but I often feel like investors that utilize this 4% rule probably feel like the Princess Merida on the back of this Clydesdale, and they've probably never ridden a Clydesdale, and they've probably never shot one of these, old school recurve bow and arrows, right? And they're just forced to try to aim at a target and get as close as they can. So I want to walk through a simple example, and Ryan and I have dissected the 4% rule over and over again on the show, but I want to give a very simple example of how confusing this can be for an investor utilizing the 4% rule. So let's say, well, and let me just preface what the 4% rule is. The 4% rule says that you can safely spend 4% of whatever amount of money you have saved up in retirement, increasing that amount with inflation, and you'll never run out of money over a 30-year period of time. So in my example, let's say that you have $1 million portfolio in 2008. Using the 4% rule, it would state that you could spend $40,000 a year spending or increasing that amount with inflation and never run out of money. Right. So think of the Princess Merida on the back of this Clydesdale. And I didn't even know you could ride Clydesdales. I've just seen them in commercials.
I hate to point out the footnote that, again, literature doesn't have footnotes. Math studies have footnotes. That rule is based on an 80% success rate. So as long as you're willing to sign up for, and 1 out of every 5 of those, I end up with no money and I'm broke, that part is not fully disclosed. And
That's
it's possibly ushering in a new unprecedented era in any stock or bond market that it hasn't factored in yet. One of the many, many, many reasons I don't like that interpretation. I would rather stick with the math, but keep going. Sorry about the footnote.
No, I love all the math, and we can get absolutely nerdy in the next episode and dissect this thing. I wanted to just make it very simple because I'm not probably as good at math as you are, but how confusing this can be an investor. So 2008, you retire, $1 million portfolio. You think you're on your way to spending $40K a year indexed to inflation for the rest of your life. Well, in my cherry-picked example, which I obviously understand the S&P 2008, the S&P drops by, depending on which month you pick, either 36% or 54%. So let's say you waited another year to retire, your portfolio drops, just take the middle, to $500,000. Now you're only spending $20,000 a year indexed to inflation. Think about what that does for how you're designing your life once you have retired, once you've reached your freedom day. It's a moving target. You're Princess Merida, but you're not as good as her. There's a scene in the movie where the princes from all these other villages come by to compete for the princess. They cannot shoot their bow at all. And they're just kind of complete nerds and dorks. And they just, the princess has had enough and she runs away. That's how confusing these rules can be. And instead, if you look at the income and the growing income, I want to be very specific here, that your portfolio is sustainably generating for you in terms of dividends that you receive as a stakeholder, you're no longer on a horse. You're probably not shooting a bow. You're just jabbing a dart right into a target because you know exactly how much money your portfolio is generating for you. And you don't have to go through the ups and downs of when do you pull money? How much can I pull? The 4% rule encourages people to spend more money when they shouldn't and less money when they could. And it just creates this confusing moving target for people, the math aside, that makes this what should be the best time of your life incredibly stressful and incredibly complex to navigate. Instead, focus on the dividends, not the sirens of the 4% rule. Don't tell the 4% rule creator that I call it a siren. You might come after me, but I truly believe it's a confusing, difficult way to plan your own finances and to rely on.
But the upside for literature nerds that hung in for this, so maybe that will usher in the next generation of great poets who have to explain to their spouse, we took a 50% pay cut this year, but let me explain why. Let me explain what that really means and how you can interpret that. I don't know, give me the math guy instead.
Yeah, imagine that conversation. It's just...
Okay. That makes me think. I want to go find that math teacher and my literature teacher. Speaking of tournaments, I'm going to track them down and get an update on how they're doing 30 years later. But anyways, I digress.
Okay, I got 2 more quickly if I could get through these.
Sorry, I'm going to stay out of the way. Take us home, brother.
All right, 2 more quick benefits of focusing on dividends and ignoring sirens. It allows you to focus on the business and not the stock, right? So I talked about this earlier very briefly, but when you focus on the stock, you think of these fancy charts and you think of candlesticks and you think of all these different things, and you take the relationship away that you have as a stakeholder with the business. If you're focusing on the dividend, it forces you to focus on what's important in the first place, why you own that business, why you own that stock. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger talked about this in their recent letter that they just released a couple days ago, maybe last week, 2 weeks ago. And it's incredible that they're in their 90s, closing in on 100, and they are still talking about, I've got all of their letters that they've ever written on my desk. And since 1967, they've talked about own businesses, not stocks on a chart. And to me, that is just incredibly powerful because it gives you a reason to invest and you understand what you're doing. Now, last one, expect less volatility. When you own companies that have paid a dividend and are growing their dividend, understanding what you own, whether it be one company or in our preferred method, a group of companies like a conglomerate, you own businesses that produce goods and services that we rely on every single day. So you're not going to be relying upon some new innovation or some new medical procedure or drug to make your finances successful. You're understanding what you're doing. And to me, this is one of the major benefits. And instead of not focusing on other things, I want the message of this podcast to be, here is what to focus on. Here is what is important. And the math backs it up entirely. All right. With that, I hope I didn't come across as too much of a literature nerd. I promise I've only read that book once, or the poem, whatever. It's a poem the size of a book. So, we'll call it a book. With that, we certainly appreciate everybody's support of the podcast. We've been growing significantly on the podcast platforms. We're also on YouTube. If you want to subscribe, leave a comment. We would appreciate that. If you want to reach out and schedule a meeting with our team, you can email us, team@freedomdaysolutions.com. And with that, we will see everybody next week.
This show is brought to you by Freedom Day Solutions, LLC, a registered investment advisory firm advising individuals and families nationwide. Performance is not guaranteed, and past results are not necessarily indicative of future performance. To learn more, visit freedomdaysolutions.com. This show contains general information that is not suitable for everyone and was shared for informational purposes only. Any forward-looking statement or opinion expressed is subject to change without notice. Nothing contained herein constitutes investment, legal, tax, or other advice, nor is it to be relied on in making investment or other decisions. Clients of Freedom Day Solutions may hold positions in the securities discussed.